Piracy in the Singapore Strait has been on the rise. 3 incidents around Christmas took the total number of reported cases last year, that's 2019, to 30. And that's up from just 8 in the Straits of Singapore and Malacca combined in 2018. Now we're joined by Nick Childs. He is Senior Fellow for Naval Forces and Maritime Security at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. Nick, thanks very much for joining us. What do you make of these latest attacks? What's fueling this rise in attacks in the Singapore Strait, you think?
Well, it's very interesting. Clearly, there seems to be something there that needs to be looked at in terms of an apparent bucking of the trend from what had been overall a sort of reduction in concerns about piracy in the region. Having said that, it's not clear to me that there's an obvious pattern beyond potentially that this may be a few individuals or groups, and it might only be small numbers of people who have decided that now's the time perhaps to take some risks and tests possible gaps in the surveillance, the patrolling and what have you that is going on in the region to counter piracy. What we've seen in the statistics you mentioned are a number of different attacks on ships underway. There were a cluster of attacks on barges apparently carrying scrap metal. So it's potentially a number of factors coming together that is causing people to look again at whether there are opportunities there. That's not to diminish the fact that this is potentially a very serious concern about safety at sea and the safety of crews involved on the ships, and potentially there's a risk also of further escalation and things getting more dangerous.
So Nick, those pirates, they are taking advantage of certain opportunities, but why are acts of such piracy so lucrative in the Straits?
Well, it's interesting that a lot of these events that you've been seeing have been people boarding ships essentially for robberies at sea, and in some cases, if the reports are to be believed, leaving empty-handed. So there will be concerns that these people are not being apprehended. So is there a deterrent effect there, or is it a case of that they will look at this over time and decide maybe the risks aren't worth it in terms of what they're doing at sea? I think it's a reminder that this is a very congested and crowded waterway. There are rich pickings potentially there, and it's difficult to guard everything all the time. It's like police on the beat. You can't guard every single individual household. And despite the precautions that are being in place, people have probably thought over time it's worth looking at the patterns, and maybe there are gaps there to be exploited. So the authorities probably should be looking at this again and looking at their procedures and whether they've perhaps got into a groove of predictability or need to focus on more responses in certain areas to try and get the potential perpetrators off guard once again.
There are some suggestions that perhaps the hijackers are very well informed, too informed maybe about the tanker movements. Do you share that sentiment, and do we know how pirates are getting such information?
Well, again, it's not clear to me in these particular cases whether these are ships that are actually being targeted because of the individual ships that they are, or whether it is gangs who are going after a particular type of vessel, a sort of slow-moving large vessel that potentially only has a few crew on board. Having said that, there are ways that need to be of concern to the authorities. That open source data that's available, just automatic information systems for tracking ships for safety, just spotting ships leaving port and patterns of behavior are all things that organized groups may be exploiting and may want to exploit. Not necessarily the case in this situation, but piracy at sea covers a broad range of potential activities.
And taking that into account, Nick, organized groups presumably would have a plan of their attack. But are we seeing changes in the nature of how these incidents take place in recent years? And if so, should this be a cause for concern?
Well, as I said, there are a whole range of activities covered by by the generic term of piracy at sea, and it ranges from opportunistic attempts at robbery at sea to hijackings to potential hostage taking to, at the very highest level, things that go beyond policing and constabulary efforts, sort of state-sponsored threats to freedom of navigation of the type we've seen in the Strait of Hormuz and around there. So all of those things are potentially risks out there. There's no one-size-fits-all in terms of how to respond to them. Clearly for robberies at sea and things like that, greater vigilance by ship owners, efforts to know who to contact to get a response from the authorities if you come under attack, and ways of safeguarding crews and the like is a way to approach this, but that doesn't necessarily fit all the scenarios. I think one of the key things is there has been a lot of efforts over the years to counter piracy, and what we've seen is in many areas the suppression of piracy as the efforts have come into play and the countermeasures have come into play, but it is only suppression because of the potential stakes there. There has to be continuing vigilance and the ability to adapt when you see different types of activity appearing in order to continue to deal with this, because international shipping is a huge high stakes business, and the responses also have to be international as well.